Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Today, Friday, January 21st, 2022, episode 89, back together in the new year. Our agenda is much as usual. COVID Connect first. We'll talk about the COVID news focused here on the state of Michigan. We'll show you those numbers where things seem to be going. After that, we continue our January series, MedTech in Higher Education. Today, I will be joined by Jonathan Fay, who until recently was the Dixon and Carol Dahl Executive Director of the University of Michigan Center for Entrepreneurship. Now he is the Director of Research, Impact, and Translation for Biomedical Engineering at the University of Michigan, as well as continuing to be the Hub Director for NSF I-Corps in the Great Lakes region. We're going to talk all about educating students from his perspective, some of that translational work, really cool stuff. We'll be going there in just a bit. After that, some time for Q&A, as always. And before we get to the COVID news, just a quick announcement. You heard last week that we were changing the tech around in the studio here to run MedTech Crossroads. I'm pleased to announce that this week we're actually streaming live on YouTube for the first time. We probably should have done it ages ago, but now anyone can tune in anywhere over YouTube. You can still always register at intobeing.com/medtech-crossroads for access into the webinar, but you can also get to us on YouTube. Just look Into Being's channel up and you will find us there. Today, the COVID metrics and vaccine distribution, always from healthdata.gov. It's been quite a while now since we started putting up the data that was put together by the CDC. CDC finally started conglomerating pretty good data on a state basis, on a per state basis. And so each week we take the state of Michigan's data and bring it to you in a nice, easy, digestible form. Here are the state synopsis from last week and this week. If you recall, last week sort of bumped back up in the state of Michigan in terms of COVID. Deaths went up, hospital admissions went up, after what seemed to be some good news, but we're actually back to looking like we might have a little bit of good news in the state of Michigan this week. We'll see. Some of the data is noisy. Some of it is not reported as frequently as it could be. So you have to look at longer term trends. Sadly, just quick trends will not tell the whole story. The graph that we've put up every week for quite a while now, vaccination rates compared to the transmission and the reported cases per 100,000. And if you recall, this graph just got darker and darker, that even in places with high vaccination, transmission cases just exploding. Of course, that's old news at this point, but it's been interesting on a historical basis to see how that graph has continued to darken. From the perspective of new cases, the trend line, the 7-day trend line, obviously very higher than before, than we've ever seen it before. The positivity rate, we should note the blue line being total tests in the state of Michigan up as high as they ever have been. The positivity rate higher than it's really ever been, except for some noise at the beginning of the pandemic, above 30% positivity. So kind of incredible numbers there. In terms of deaths, always sad news. It is, I suppose, good, but not good for the families that are suffering with it. It's good to see that 7-day trend line still below any local highs that we've ever had, but still our hearts always go out to any families who are suffering with losses of loved ones. In terms of hospital admissions, this got our hopes up about a month ago, looking like we had crossed a peak. That peak may be here now. We will see. Certainly similar height to the previous ones, but we're just hoping to see that drop down the backside, but looking very much like previous peaks, except maybe now a little wider than before. Some of those prior peaks came and went in the state of Michigan anyways, perhaps a little bit faster. And if I show you last week's picture versus this week's picture for transmission in the state of Michigan, it looks exactly like it has for the last number of months, a sea of red going on now for quite a while. Vaccinations, there was this slow climb out for quite a while, ever since June or July. That has now dropped off. This is national, not Michigan. This is national vaccinations hovering right around the daily count of 1 million doses administered. And if we look at transmission by county in the United States, again, as it has been, also a sea of red. This is actually last week's data, but it looks the same as this week's. Now, it is worth noting that things lag. We know this. We've known this for a long time. And when we look at hospitalizations, one of the most important metrics to be looking at, because hospitals, even if a pandemic is on the way down, these hospitals can still be overwhelmed. And if we look 2 weeks ago, there were 5 states that were in this 15 to 20 beds per 100 filled with COVID patients. Remember why that 15 plus to 20 beds is important? Because a hospital's trying to run 80% full. They're trying to run 80 beds out of 100, and if you suddenly throw an extra 15 or 20, that just put them at capacity. That's why those numbers matter. It doesn't take many people to push you over a meaningful limit. 2 weeks later now, where we are today, we are looking at more than half the states in that 15 to 20 or higher beds per 100 having counties filled that way. So despite the fact that you're hearing on the news that COVID is dropping, right now is when those hospitalizations are hitting. The hope, because Omicron seems to be milder, is that the deaths will never reach the point that they might have during a previous wave. But certainly some sobering news here nationwide, changed heavily in just the last 2 weeks. Hat tip to University of Michigan, Michigan Medicine, with their COVID tracker here and who is in the hospital. You can see perhaps just a little, tiny bit more than half of the hospitalized people are unvaccinated. About just under half are vaccinated. A very small percentage vaccinated plus boosted, shown there in the teal color. Hat goes off to Michigan because they're tracking which of these have significant underlying disease, are immunocompromised, or are greater than 65 years old. So really good data there. And as always, thanks to all those who are caring for those in the hospital. Spectrum Health, also a nice graphic showing their data. We won't go through every part of this, but just know that you can get these graphics oftentimes off of the Facebook page from these hospital systems. So know that you can find out what's going on with them very frequently right from their Facebook page. Spectrum Health here as of January 18th. Some data from Beaumont showing that they might be reaching a peak there. We will see patients with COVID-19 infection just about as high as the peak in April of 2021, but a more protracted growth there. Here's Henry Ford Health System, similar types of numbers, although this one's a little bit older, January 10th. As of January 10th, they still had a majority of unvaccinated patients hospitalized for COVID. Who knows how that's changed in the last week or two, but hopefully they will update that data. But they also put this forward, which I think is a fascinating graphic. It shows, and if again, you can get to this through Henry Ford's Facebook page, showing is it COVID-19 or something else? Note, neither MedTech Crossroads nor Henry Ford is saying that this is medical advice. Got to repeat that, it's right at the bottom of the slide. But it's fascinating because Omicron, shortness of breath, high-grade fever, body aches, loss of taste or smell, nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea, sneezing, don't appear to be always part of Omicron. That's kind of amazing because that makes it relatively indistinguishable from the common cold, which you can see in that rightmost column. I think that's part of the reason it's been transmitting so much, because the symptomatology, very, very different from Delta and very different from the flu as well. So if you were confused by whether it was Omicron going around or not, you can be forgiven a little bit because of the loss of some of those key symptoms that made us think that something was COVID. That's the COVID news. I want to tell you really briefly about something that our friends over at XLerate Health are putting out. Sebastian Alvim sent this our way, especially if you are a resident of Flint or Genesee counties. They actually have scholarships for you to take this program for free. I think others are welcome as well. They have a pre-accelerator program, idea stage business or startup looking to develop an idea or launch a new product. It's an 8-week program to help entrepreneurs of all levels move from concept to execution. So it's Thursdays, 6 to 8 p.m., February 4th through March 24th. You've got to register by the end of January, but they certainly want to help you accelerate your early stage idea. And you can register by sending an email to Sebastian, Sebastian, at XLerate, that starts with an X, XLerateHealth.com. Well, with that, we made it through the news, and I am just so excited to be continuing this focus on higher education. As you know, on MedTech Crossroads, we have talked in previous years to many different people, but it's been kind of ad hoc. Oh, we'll talk to this person about this, and we'll talk to that person about that, and very frequently it came directly out of what was happening live with responses to COVID. This year in 2022, we decided that it would be important to start to do more series work, to talk about a topic, but to talk about it for a few weeks at a time. So we're talking first this year about MedTech and higher education, something that we neglected last year. But it's really important because people get trained for this industry. What are they being exposed to? How are people thinking about that education? That's been our focus in January. In future months, we'll go on to other topics, things like customer discovery, things like intellectual property, finance, how do you raise VC capital, medical device development, and more. But this week, we continue the MedTech Higher Education series, and I am joined by Jonathan Fay, who is with the University of Michigan. And there he is, Jonathan. The technology didn't let us down. You made it.
All right. Thanks, Gene. Happy to be here.
It's great to have you here. Jonathan, as I mentioned earlier, is now the Director of Research, Impact, and Translation, Biomedical Engineering at University of Michigan, still the Hub Director of the NSF I-Corps. And if you haven't heard about NSF I-Corps, you're going to hear a little bit about it today. You'll also probably hear about it in a future show when we talk about customer discovery. Real important resource. Until earlier this month, Jonathan was the Executive Director of the Center for Entrepreneurship at the University of Michigan. And Jonathan, I would love for you to just give us a little background on what these roles are, including the one you just have departed from, but also a little bit about your history. How did you get to what you're doing? It takes a very special person to want to educate people, as we've talked in earlier weeks, on relatively open-ended things. What makes somebody crazy enough to do that, and how did you get here?
Yeah, I have to admit, I've always had a pull toward higher education. It turns out both of my grandmothers are teachers, and I guess some of that eventually rubbed off and brought me back into the education world. In terms of, how I got here, just going back quite a ways, when I was a PhD student myself out on the West Coast, I thought I was going to be a faculty member, right? I loved research. I loved doing biomedical research. I was studying hearing at the time. So I know more than probably 5 people on the planet about the eardrum, which is, interesting. Not a lot of applications of that, but interesting. And then I kind of got, halfway through that. I'm like, I myself, I needed more kind of patient impact. I wanted to see stuff get used on patients. I wanted to see them get better. I wanted to see the outcomes. And so I started to try to figure out, how might I do that? Do I want to become a doctor? Do I, tried to sort that out. And because I was on the West Coast, I was lucky enough that stumbled into the kind of the MedTech startup ecosystem. And met a few people. They're like, hey, we'd love to have you come interview. And so I did that. And sure enough, I ended up in a small company called Natus Medical on the West Coast. And they were doing infant hearing screening.
Wow.
And so with that company, got to see, because they were fairly far along. I mean, they were about 100 employees, profitable, about 30 million in revenue. And I got tapped on the shoulder and said, Jonathan, would you help us do product number 2? And so I don't know, that's one of the great mysteries of life. Like I'm fresh out of school, never run a product development cycle in my life. And here's this company saying, here, do product number 2. Okay. I was too dumb to say no. So I did it. And I was lucky enough that in that company, there were a lot of the senior executives that knew what they were doing. And I was smart enough, I guess, to go ask for help. Say, I don't know what I'm doing. And they said, okay, here's what you do. Okay, good. And then come back a week later. Okay, I did that. Now what's next? And 18 months later, got the product onto the market. It's still being sold today. It's the Algo 3i. It's the handheld version of what they had before. And it was really targeted at the European market. So the awesome thing is I got to see that whole cycle from whiteboard drawings, early risk analysis, all the way through transfer to manufacturing, regulatory, US and EU, out to shipping it and, distribution in a foreign country. So got to see all of that. And that was a fabulous kind of learning experience, and also pretty awesome as a kind of a newly minted PhD to see, oh my goodness, like this is what happens. Nurses are actually using this on babies and we're catching hearing loss. This is incredible. I want to do more of this. And so from there, went on and kind of went to smaller and smaller organizations until Earlens Corporation, where I helped found that with my 3 co-founders. And then I ran that company for the kind of its first 7 years of existence. Kind of got it. My shtick is I usually do early technology development, first clinical filings, IDE, get that clinical trial data together. And then when the company needs to kind of go from that R&D into like, okay, heavy operations, we need to manufacture this, then there's better people than me at that stuff. So bring in the new leadership team, raise a buttload more money, and let them take a commercial. So, and that's kind of what Earlens is doing. But, after leading that company for a while, I thought, I think I would like to teach. I'd like to try that. And so the University of Michigan was just standing up their I-Corps program and thought I would be a good fit, and came back and did that. And here I am 10 years later. It's amazing.
That's amazing. And of course, I-Corps has become a major regional resource that we'll talk about here in a second. When you and I were talking earlier, Jonathan, I didn't even recognize it, but it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe a critical point in your career would have been when you went to work for that company to develop that second product line. I mean, you're not a person easily dissuaded, but I could imagine being sort of turned off if your superiors in that hadn't been willing to do some part of an educational process. You said you could come to them for mentoring, you could come to them with your open-ended problems and say, hey, what am I going to do? But I hadn't put that together when we talked earlier. Like that was an important point for you. Do you think the path would have been different if you had just been thrown into the deep end with no resources?
Oh, I would have failed miserably. So I think the outcome would have been different. Of course, I wouldn't have been able to learn what I did learn because we wouldn't have gotten as far as we did. Actually at some point in that project did try to fail. I got my first real dose of company politics and how to navigate those. And at one point I had to go to my boss and say, if we want this thing to go to market, we're going to have to dump another couple $1 million into it. And here's what we need, and here's where it's failing. And, they had to have discussions about whether or not they were going to do that. And they did do it. And we got it. We hired the right consultants and got it going, got it back on track. But without that mentorship, I just look back at that team and think about, my boss, Brian, really understood R&D. We had a regulatory expert who was phenomenal. Transfer to manufacturing people, regulatory. It was a great team that I could learn from, and I'm so thankful for that experience.
That's really cool. Now you're passing that kind of knowledge on to others. Tell us just a bit about this change. Director of Center for Entrepreneurship, going to the we tried to diversify. We ended up with a lot of people from BME talking. It's just like apparently the new hub of everything these days. But some things moved with you too. Tell us just a bit about these positions, these roles, and what has moved with you.
Well, I'll give you the people, the motivating factor behind the move. The big thing is that the exec director job at CFE just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the center has had great success. I think if you count now, we have over 6,000 participants in our programs every year. I like to joke with our dean that we actually teach more student credit hours than actually 3 of the engineering departments. So it's a beast. But with the I-Corps hub coming in, that was a significant expansion of that program. That's going to quadruple or quintuple the size of that program. I had to go to them and say, this isn't going to work. I can't do both jobs. And so how are we going to divide it up? And the way they decided to do it, and I agree with this, is that we're going to keep all of like the traditional, more educational undergrad stuff together. And then the items that are more kind of research enterprise facing commercialization education pieces would stay with me, because I'd take over I-Corps. And then the other big thing that's staying with me is the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund, which for those on the call, I mean, that's been a phenomenal run. We've been running that for 5 years now. It's really been a game changer for some of the technologies coming out of U of M in terms of placing that first investment or catalyzing that first investment. And so I've been really proud of the work we've done there. In fact, it's been so successful that now I think Innovation Partnerships, formerly Tech Transfer, is now doing XLerate Blue outside of life sciences. So they're really focused on tech investing. But it was really the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund that kind of plowed that ground, the university figured out what to do with a venture fund internally. And now that they get to follow on and do the tech side, which is great.
That's really cool. And just a word too about I-Corps for those who don't know about it. I know that when we talk to teams that have gone through I-Corps, they sort of take a deep breath and they go, yeah, like I had to go call 100 people. I had to cold call 100 people and find out what their needs were in this space. And it's just this fear of like, oh my goodness, I thought I was an adult, but I never did this before kind of a thing. Amazing program. I think in a future series, Jonathan, we're going to dive deeper into I-Corps and the process of customer discovery, because when we talk about new product development, it's so important, and we want to do that justice. But in both of these, Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund, you've got funding being given, reviews being made, and in I-Corps, as you and I talked before, you're often taking students who product development, medical devices, et cetera, drugs may be their career, but may well not be. It may not even be on their radar.
Yeah.
You have a very interesting philosophy about that.
Yeah.
Why do you do it?
If we think about, our population, a lot of people think about commercialization education as really about startups, right? We're going to generate startups. We're going to have them go out there and start companies. My philosophy is that, startups just a tool. It's a type of commercialization. It's certainly not the only way to commercialize something. And in fact, it actually, especially the venture-backed startup, is actually a pretty rare commodity. There's so many other innovations and discoveries that come out of the work we do, where other pathways are really taken. I would say actually the dominant outcome of I-Corps is that postdoc or PhD student does those 100 interviews, kind of figures out where their research has values, and then they get hired. Right. And I'm just like, touchdown. Woo. Right there. The technology and the know-how of that student just made it to the right place in the economy to add value. And that's what we're looking for. Not all of this stuff is going to be the basis of a venture-backed company, and that's okay. But there needs to be mechanisms. I mean, if you look at universities as a whole, what are our two major products? Our major products are our students and our research. That's the two those are the two businesses we're in. So when I think about how to make an impact and how to make a difference, it's really through making sure that the people coming out of the university get into the right spots in the economy where they can add the most value and their knowledge can be useful.
And part of that process may be giving them these types of open-ended questions, and some could lead to these venture-backed companies and some won't. But either way, It's getting their knowledge and their experience is getting out there.
Exactly.
Jonathan, you've had some interesting thoughts too about the type of research that's undertaken. And actually, I think we have a slide here, which I had never seen before, and I'm always one for a new way of looking at the world. Tell us about this and how it enters into your educational approach. And just to set the stage again for folks, we've got programs here that are like someone will come to the Biomedical Venture Fund and will say, hey, I've got a great idea, you should fund me. And you guys are coming back and you're saying, well, hold on, we're going to give you feedback on that. Or they're coming to I-Corps and you're letting real users sort of, for lack of a better word, beat them up over the ideas. So you got these mechanisms for education, but this kind of gets to a little bit of some philosophy behind what can we even be going towards? Tell us about this.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Going back to what you just said about the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund, that fund really is, we want it to evergreen. And if we have investors on the call, they will know if you're investing early, evergreening a fund is extremely difficult. So we have to be very choosy and picky about what we're going to back with the fund. But people always ask me, why does the university need a venture fund? Like, their venture capitalists exist and they fund things all the time. And at least my experience when I was pitching VCs is a lot of the times you're not getting, really specific and direct feedback from the VCs. We always used to joke VCs have 100 ways of saying no without saying no. And it's often hard to know kind of what's quite not right and what do you need to do different or what do you need to work on. So I think that's where things like the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund are super important because they have that lens, they have that same bar as a institutional investor, but we're willing to tell the investigators, this is why it's not ready, or this is the key risk we see, or your team, you talk about it in this way, and we don't think that's the right value proposition or the right customer, based on the due diligence that we did. Right. So I think that's, to me, even though it's a venture fund, it really is a venture fund. It serves that educational mission for our investigators. And the other thing about that's cool is because that venture fund is connected to coastal investors, we can communicate back to our community what's being invested in, what are the hot areas, and try to get that information flowing faster back to our region. So that's kind of a little quick primer on why I think that venture fund is so critical for us. But it also deals with the graph you've got here. Yeah,
you're saying that a normal venture fund wouldn't necessarily tell you, they'll be nice to you and they'll say, hey, come back if they're interested, or maybe if they're not. But you're saying that the real value here of education is the fact that you're going to come back and you're going to dump the reasoning behind that back to the team.
Yep. In specific things we heard in the diligence, right?
Great.
I may not tell you exactly who said it, right? We don't really want to get into an argument about it, but hey, these are the types of things we're hearing about this technology or this area or the viability of this long term. And then of course it's on the investigators to okay, how do you respond to that? What are the objections? How do we get over that? Are they right? There are a number of ways that can go forward, and hopefully then they come back maybe a year or two later with something even better. So
and that's will also tell you a little bit about whether that team really wants, this goes back to an earlier point that you made, whether that team really wants to be in this business or not, or whether it taught them enough to know what this is like, and no, I can't take that kind of heat.
Right. Yeah, there was once a faculty member at I think it was North Carolina, Joseph D. Simone, that said, you want to talk about peer review? Go through the due diligence process. That's like peer review on steroids.
There you go. I love it. That's great.
But yeah.
Let's bring this slide back up here, because one of the this really really got me when you described it to me. Ideas do come; they come through. They'll go through programs like this. They'll be presented to true investors for Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund. They will be put in front of users through I-Corps, and I'm sure you do some mentoring all around the sides of that too. This characterizes sort of creativity versus utility a little bit, or maybe understanding versus utility. Tell us about this Pasteur's quadrant.
Yeah, this is a little different way of categorizing different types of kind of research or innovation activity out there. And the backdrop for this was this I got this slide from some people at the National Science Foundation. I think they stole it from someone else. I think Donald Stokes up there. But I'll give people a little background. I think it's fascinating. I think on this call and other calls, you've probably heard about basic research and applied research. Well, guess what? Prior to World War II, those terms were never used. When the National Science Foundation was first stood up, I think right after World War II, that's when those terms first came into use. And the reason that they came into use then was Vannevar Bush, who founded the National Science Foundation, made a deal with Harry Truman. And the deal was, you can get the money to do this science stuff because it's proved very useful for the war effort, but you got to promise not to compete with industry, right? And so that's when these terms came up, like, okay, so applied research is what industry does. We're doing basic research, and that's how we're going to kind of divide the universe. But it's important that, that's not that long ago that those terms were basically brought into use. This graph is a different way of looking at it. And I actually like it better because, on the one axis, it's, that search for fundamental understanding. And if you guys don't know that one picture in the upper left, where it's really about fundamental understanding, but there's no kind of thought to how it would ever be used, that's Niels Bohr, right? He's the guy who came up with kind of our first models of the structure of the atom. And I love that quote. What is that? Everything we can consider is made up of things that can't be considered real. Like, can you imagine saying that in a board meeting? Like, that's not going to fly, right? So, but he did some great work, right? And then the bottom right, it's Edison, right? Who just tried a bunch of stuff, and there was no real theory behind it, but just tried a bunch of stuff and trying to figure out what works. And eventually he found something, but his real goal was sellable, right? It has to have economic value. And I think where the science agencies are today is they're trying to find projects that meet both of those criteria. And the example that they like to give is Louis Pasteur. So Louis Pasteur did some amazing work with microbes and our fundamental understanding of how those systems work, but it had immense economic impact for France, right? Why did the French government fund his work? Well, what were their major exports? Their major exports were wine and cheese, which those exports depend on microbes doing what they're supposed to be doing and not causing spoilage and other things. So, there were huge economic impacts as well as huge science impact of that work. And so if you can articulate your work and find something in that Pasteur's quadrant, and that's kind of the culture change that we're trying to create throughout the university, and I think we've been largely successful over the last decade, is, hey, we've always wanted to do stuff in the upper left. Let's rebalance. Let's move some things into that Pasteur's quadrant that also have a lot of great economic impact or social impact for us.
It's really interesting. I would agree with you that the universities have really done a good job of this, of bringing people in and sort of asking much more Edisonian questions of basic research to come to a more neutral point. I guess if there were a counterpoint to this, or somebody out there is sort of thinking in their head, but aren't universities supposed to be about basic research? Shouldn't it? So then again, I think you and I both work in the world of translation, and so we're trying for that Pasteur's quadrant in our work unapologetically. But there's going to be somebody out there who's like, well, I think universities are supposed to be about basic research. What are you guys doing? Leave that to industry. I don't want to hear about it. We should be funding the Niels Bohrs of the world. That's what universities are for. So just to throw that out there, what's your response to that? What is the right balance between these things?
I think balance is the right word. You don't want to be tilted too far one way or the other. I think that in general, people have felt like universities have been too far into the basic science and not enough of the other. And so we're kind of trying to move a little bit in that direction. But we're right. We don't want to swing the pendulum too far away, or else we won't get those material science breakthroughs that have completely unclear applications, but could be amazing, right? So it is something where you do want to be mindful. You don't want to completely, like, oh, we're going to be completely abandoning that. and run the other direction. You just want a balance of those two things and to think carefully about that balance. And the way you do that is just thinking about, like, this is done at departments by departments. They think about the mix of faculty members when old faculty members retire or new lines become available. What's the mix in our department? What are those emerging fields we want to be in? And try to make sure that they make smart hires as they go forward.
And I guess at some level, you could make the argument that Pasteur, that taking that quadrant approach, isn't really ignoring either one. It's just putting a bunch of information out there and then selecting what you're going to work on holistically, as opposed to running off purely on a capitalist, I got to make a buck off of this, or purely on a pursuing something out in the ether. Well, that kind of. Oh, go ahead, Jonathan. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that a lot of stuff in Pasteur's quadrant, I mean, it's not ready for industry funding. There wouldn't be a ROI that makes any sense to a corporation in that quadrant many times. And so that's where I think, government funding needs to be. But we should be mindful that, even if we're doing, basic research, we should have an idea of like what the impact might be and why we're doing it and what the impact on society might be. I think those are fair questions to ask.
Yeah, and how far from impact it might be. I think that's one we often see is this idea, is this 1 year from application? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 30 years? Just knowing where you are in that continuum can be incredibly valuable to everybody involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this kind of brings us to be in that quadrant. You kind of have to have awareness of a bunch of different domains, and the term multidisciplinary is often brought in. But I understand you reject the term multidisciplinary for a greater term.
Yeah, I like the term transdisciplinary, because I used to joke that multidisciplinary in engineering means that an ME student is sitting next to a computer science student. That's multidisciplinary. And I don't know about Eugene, but the biggest arguments I've had in my career were never with the other engineers. It was with marketing or operations or somebody else from a completely different discipline. So I like the terms transdisciplinary, like you're really bridging across big disciplines, maybe outside of the sciences even. And I also like the term transorganizational, because I think that's something that we're going to have to wrestle with, in that, if you look at some of the big challenges we have in the climate or in transportation, it's actually a mixture of different organizations that have to work together. Startups on their own won't be able to solve it. These are highly interconnected systems that are being changed. And so you have to have large companies, startups trying to, do their bit. Also, government has to be involved in the right way, setting policies. And you kind of have to have an understanding of how all those pieces work and who's got the right strengths, so that you don't end up, the wrong organization isn't trying to do what another organization should, and try to get our students to have some kind of awareness of those kinds of issues.
And that's a really important one. I understand you have some pretty cool and maybe I'd say bold techniques for teaching stuff like that. I know you and I had discussed at least one in the biofuels space that. Maybe if you were thinking you were here to make a technical solution to something, you're throwing them like into the realm of politics here.
Yeah. The example I like is we have a company we work with. I teach a class called Innovation for Impact Climate Change, where we engage with emerging companies in that space, and one of them was making ethanol, and of course, a lot of people, when they think ethanol, they think corn ethanol, right? That's the dominant form. But this company was making it from trash, right? So you could ferment the trash, you get the gas, and then you could make the ethanol. Well, the students are humming right along, and they're trying to do economic analysis, which market, blah, blah, blah. And they run across a federal policy. And as they read the ethanol subsidy policy, it only applies to biologically based ethanols. So this company doesn't qualify, right? So, if somebody who wrote that policy had even anticipated that there might have been different ways, or it wasn't just a blind, subsidy for corn farmers, you might have written it differently. And this is kind of one of the outcomes we're hoping for, is that, a lot of these scientists and engineers, they might hopefully go write some policies or be involved in politics in a way where they're aware of some of these issues, that it's, you don't want to be in a situation, I don't know, that maybe your callers will agree or disagree, but I don't like it when my government picks winners and losers. I like it when they kind of set the table and then let the market kind of figure out like what the best solutions are. And they try to set the incentives, and then everyone competes kind of on that level playing field. I like those solutions a lot better. But if you're not careful when you write these policies, you can build in walls to certain innovations coming to market.
You certainly can build in walls, and this example that you've just given, I think, is absolutely fascinating, because here we are in a domain where, hey, are alternative fuels cool? Absolutely. Are we trying to do things to incentivize them? Yeah, but we didn't think big enough when we wrote the incentive. And I guess the arguments could go on for days, and I don't understand the inside of it, so I won't even go there. But like, was it specific? Oh, we're going to help this group, and we're not really interested in fuels, or was it just short-sighted to not realize, oh, there's other ways to generate these. We've excluded those from the process. And then to think that a student studying this with you might be thinking that they're there to, think about chemical engineering or environmental engineering, and you've just taken them full blown into the world of lawmaking, really.
Yeah. And that's kind of fun too, because you can kind of jump from that point where they kind of understand the impact of the policy. And then you can ask them, well, how does the legislative office work? Like, who's in that office? What are the different job functions? And they usually have no idea. Right. And like their first instinct might be, well, I'm going to call the elected official. I'm like, yeah, good luck getting them on the phone. Right. So, who else? Well, maybe you can get an assistant legislative analyst, right? Somebody that's like 3 or 4 levels down in the organization. Try to get them on the phone. Right. And which Congress people are actually working on this, right? Which ones are actually interested, and see if you can get the students to actually get one of those on the phone and see what happens. It's just kind of fun they have conversations they never would have had otherwise, and it's really fun to see them kind of bring back the insight and be all excited about it.
Well, it's a really important point, because we've seen so many people with cool ideas, right? Amazing ideas that probably technically will work, who, unaware of what the structural, political, regulatory, legal, financial hurdles around them are facing an obvious problem where this could never be implemented. It could never be adopted. And it kind of hurts your heart, because it's like, well, we'd like to think that any cool idea should get a fair shake. But it's often up against all these walls, these transdisciplinary, trans-organizational walls. I think it's a really cool thing you're bringing light to. Give us another example of this principle. Yeah, let's take a few of these examples out here.
Yeah, another one is as simple as it sounds is the QWERTY keyboard. Right, like most people probably on the call know that the QWERTY keyboard was developed to slow us down, right, to make us type slower, so the old mechanical printers wouldn't jam. Right, they actually put the letters in bizarre spots. Well, okay. So I can develop a keyboard that if you try to go out there and like, oh, people want to type faster, people want to type more accurately. Yes, they do. That sounds great. But they're like, so you want a different keyboard? And by the way, there are these out there, right? There's these other keyboards that are supposedly faster and more ergonomic and things like that out there. But look at the adoption of them. There's nothing. And I try to get the students to try to unpack, why is that? This looks superior from a functional and technical point of view. This looks like a better keyboard. What is going on? And then they run in and they finally discover that it's that training barrier. It's that lock-ins, the fact that we've been typing on these keyboards for years and nobody wants to go back. And how would you ever get this interconnected system to switch over all at once? Like, that's way above, I think, any of our pay grades to make that happen. And so just getting them to understand those kinds of barriers and those kinds of issues, I think are really important. The other one that I always use is, my old company, EarLens, I point out to them that the cost of parts for that device was 0.18% of the selling price. So if you come to me with a cheaper microphone for that hearing aid, do I care? No, I don't care. I don't care at all. I want reliable. I want consistent. Yeah, maybe at some point when the VP of Ops is making 100 million of them and they want to save 30 cents on each one. Okay, now, maybe at that point someone will care. But right now, when we're making tens of thousands of them, this is not my highest priority. And so again, trying to have people understand the different incentives and who they're talking to and what their real challenges are and risks, and then they can incorporate that knowledge and actually, in some ways, build empathy, so they understand what problem they're really solving, for their different stakeholders.
You just use one of my favorite words, empathy. Not necessarily sympathy. I'm not saying that I feel exactly the same way, but I understand why you would feel that way. It's also interesting that I think a lot of times people, especially technologists, which is many that you're educating, will say to themselves, "Oh, by saying that I should be focusing over here, not here, you're saying that this isn't important." And instead, what you're saying is all of these things could be the most important thing right now. Let's figure out which one is, and let's address that, which is a very important difference. You're not saying, oh, this domain over here, like of politics, is the most important domain. You're just saying it might be the one that's most in our way right now. Be wise enough to see which one is in your way right now.
Yeah, and that really helps them understand how to build value the fastest. Like, out of all these different things that we've looked at, which is the biggest risk, right? Which one is the one that might kill us the fastest, right? And say, okay, let's work on that one first. Okay, and they kind of understand then, with your limited time, where should you focus, right? Because there's always, especially in a startup, right? There's always way too many things to do. So you have to sequence it. And then how are you going to build value in your company? Well, you have to understand the risks in a lot of different areas and where you're going to spend your time.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal educational approach. I think it's so much fun talking to Jonathan because we've seen sort of different parts of the world, and yet this break this thing down into a philosophy and take this philosophy to other people and teach it to them. It's really fun to see you doing that and doing it with such passion.
Yeah.
And of course, today we're meeting the Jonathan Fay of 2022, but you've been in this for a while. You were with Earlens, you were with others before that. How has your philosophy changed? If you go back to the start of your career, how would you describe those two Jonathans that you see today and at the start?
Well, I guess in many ways, maybe it's because I've become an educator. I really believe that you gotta have to let people bump into their own walls. And you have to be the guide on the side, not the consultant telling them what to do. Especially in I-Corps, right? You can beat them up all day long. You can tell them what's wrong with their product, and they may or may not believe you. But if you show them a process where they discover what's wrong and they internalize what's gone wrong, and they can open their ears and really hear what their customers, then I've done them a real service. Because it's not only going to apply to this thing, it's going to apply to the next 10 things that they try to do. So I think in terms, when I started, I'm like, oh, I'm going to teach them regulatory, I'm going to teach them quality system, I'm going to teach all this stuff, right? I'm going to teach them kind of stuff. And now we still teach them stuff, but we try to do it in the context of actually having experiences, because it really seems to stick way better. They can contextualize it and they understand it when they come out the other end way better than if I just, we're going to go through ISO 14791 here. go through this thing. It won't stick the same way that if they actually had to wrestle with it in an actual project and figure it out.
Meeting a standard, if you just read it, good luck. If you read it and try to implement it, we're doing better. If you read it and try to implement it and then get audited on it. Wow, yeah. I really remember
your level
it well.
Of focus goes way up.
That's great. Well, this is awesome. In the last maybe 4 minutes that we got together here, Jonathan, first of all, I want to turn to our audience and say, if you have any questions for Jonathan, comments for us, please do. Today, what I do need to ask you to do is to type it into the Q&A box. Because of some tech changes, I don't have an immediate way to bring everybody live like we've often done. We're still working on methods for that. So if you have a question or a comment, please type it today into the Q&A box, and we'll make that live. We're working on solutions for that, but I do see one hand raised, so go ahead and type that today into the Q&A box. While we're waiting for those questions or comments, I want to bring up another slide that we have here, which you're now published, Jonathan. This article that you just put forward. If we can go full screen on that, optimism versus lying: what Elizabeth Holmes can teach young entrepreneurs. Wow, you just absolutely put your foot forward there. People can read about this on your through your LinkedIn. They can read about it on the U of M Center for Entrepreneurship website. But give us a little 2-minute perspective here. Obviously, Elizabeth Holmes, Theranos, amazing sort of failure, I think people would say, and yet we've all seen that kind of hype creeping out in startups. What's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was one of those things where, obviously the Theranos situation is an extreme example. Out there, things got way off the rails on that one. But I also saw echoes, on a much smaller scale of things I experienced myself. And in the piece, I talk about an experience where, you're a startup, you're trying to raise money. You're trying to put a product development plan together. And your first version, because you've done these things, how much uncertainty are, how many iterations there are. You put the plan together and you're like, okay, that's 4 years and $20 million. And then your boss, your chairman sitting there going, that's not fundable. Right? Try again. And you got to come up with a different thing that you're trying to do. And in some ways, that response, it's a fair question, right? Again, back to how do you build value the fastest? And can you kind of meet the bars and expectations of the investing community? And, I could see a slope toward putting something forward that is, doesn't have a lot of chance of success. Now, again, most smart investors are, have people around them or themselves that can kind of temper that, right? Because they're like, well, this isn't credible, right? You can't do that, and that's not going to work. But I also knew there's still some gray zone there because the internal team knows a lot more about the risks and the problems. And it just becomes a real interesting communication challenge about how do you, especially as the engineer, right? You're the one responsible for making this thing work and delivering it on time. Like, how do you communicate the risks in a way that is both truthful? At the same time, of course, you want to be optimistic because, of course, you are optimistic that you can solve the problems. And just finding that line is, it's a struggle. It's a challenge. And certainly something that I had to wrestle with as an executive in the industry.
That's an important wrestling to have. I think just calling people to that dialogue is really, really important as they're learning about this, so as to not repeat. We had a student on a week ago, I think it was, and one of her calls to action for our audience was let's be more ethical. And I think to do that, we actually have to ask the question: is what does that mean? So I think that's a great article you put out there. Couple questions here, and just a note: we will be talking more about I-Corps in a future show when we talk more directly about customer discovery. Obviously, this week's focus more education. But a question here from Denise, I think we should definitely answer. What's the best way for researchers or clinicians to get involved with a local I-Corps program?
Well, the best way is go to the Midwest I-Corps website. All of the programs and contact information are listed right there. If you're interested in a specific program, and also contact Divya. Divya Patil in my office is the contact person. I think her contact's on that page directly. And if you call her up and have a conversation about your project, we can get you to the right program. Because, Gene talked about there's some very intense programs as a part of I-Corps, but there's also some one-time workshops. We've tried to really develop a whole portfolio of programs that really meet the needs of researchers all across the spectrum, from ideation to serious commercialization. So, with that, have that first conversation with us, and then we can kind of route you to the right first program for you.
Great. Great answer. And again, we will come back to I-Corps when we talk about customer discovery, because I think it's a standout representation of how to do that. So we'll definitely be talking about that more. Kenneth Spencer, hi Jonathan, can you talk about how you changed the original I-Corps, which didn't really work for clinicians, and made it usable for the folks with clinical schedules? Also, Steve Blank has modified the BMC for things like DoD, et cetera. Do you foresee a fine-tuned BMC? You can unpack that three-letter acronym for us, for machine learning, analytics, devices, therapeutics.
Yeah, so it's a great question, Ken. Good to hear you again. Yeah, so one of the things we did do for busy clinicians, and we did this in partnership also with Fast Forward Medical Innovation over in the medical school, is come up with kind of a lighter version of the course that's like kind of like Fridays for a couple of hours. Because we do recognize that clinicians are extremely busy and they're trying to see patients, and we totally get that. I do think it's also important for clinicians to recognize that they need to start building a team around themselves that does have the time to do the heavy lifting and ground pounding needed to sort some of these things out. And I think that's very important for them to recognize, and who should they attract to themselves. Now, Steve Blank he's one of the founders of this lean methodology, or lean startup methodology. The BMC stands for Business Model Canvas. And basically it's a way of taking any business and breaking it down into 9 boxes, where you basically put in your hypothesis or your guesses for how the business is going to work. And then you use customer discovery to go out and find out if what your guess was correct or not. Over the years, there have been various ones proposed for DoD. So we actually do teach the mission model canvas. We have a Innovators for Impact defense and security class as well, that actually takes projects from DoD and teaches the mission model canvas. And really, that's a recognition that if you're going to deploy something within DoD, you have other stakeholders that have other priorities than just economic ones or patient impact ones. So you need to factor those in. And so he's tried to make that more explicit in those. In terms of things in the life science, I have not heard of any modifications that people have made for machine learning or other things. In some ways, I have to admit, I like to just work within the general framework and then tailor it through exactly how I teach it to these different disciplines, versus trying to come up with a business model canvas for kind of every single case. Because then it gets a little confusing for everybody. Like, oh, I use this one in that case, and this one in that case. So I think that's where an experienced instructor can really help teams understand how to apply this general tool for their particular case, and where to really dig. So
great answers. And again, we apologize to the audience for, as we're making these tech changes, not having a way to bring questioners live right at the moment. We are going to continue to work on that. Part of our motivation there was to get higher quality recordings for future playback as well. But great answer there, Jonathan. And Ken and Denise, thank you for the questions. Well, Jonathan, we're at the top of the hour. First of all, I want to thank you for being with us. Hope you will come back when we start to talk in series format more about customer discovery, because you have a wealth that we haven't even scratched the surface on. So we're looking forward to learning from you more. But send us out today with sort of your final thoughts. As we think about MedTech and higher education, you've talked to us today about ways to think about it, ways to think about value, finding value as you consider transdisciplinary and trans-corporate perspectives, and even just this willingness to expose people who aren't going to be in a particular type of company to a really open-ended set of things. I think this has been really valuable. Give us a final thought as education and MedTech starts to round out for us.
Yeah, I mean, my final thought would be, whenever you're working with students, try to get them to build as much empathy for others and understanding of others' incentives as you can, and make sure you build in honest feedback. So they really, you don't kind of hide things that, if they're starting to do something that doesn't make sense, calling it out, in of course a respectful way, but making sure they understand, why that's not going to work, or why you think it's not going to work. And also being humble about it, because, we're not always right, and being open to them bringing back data to the contrary. So make it a dialogue about empathy and an honest exchange of, what the risks are and how these things might play out.
That's awesome. Well, we appreciate having you here today, Jonathan. Thank you so much. Thank you to our audience as well. Thank you for your questions. We're at the top of the hour, so we're going to look forward to next week, where we will continue our focus on MedTech and education. Can't wait to be with you. Hope there's better news with COVID by next week, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for being with us here on MedTech Crossroads. Bye-bye.